All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to explore how one of history's absolutely most profound philosophical concepts, Advaita Vedānta, was actually created. And what's wild here is that it was forged by mashing together two fiercely opposing ancient worldviews. We're talking about a massive philosophical collision that literally changed human thought forever.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the Axial Age revolution, then look at the Upanishadic reality, followed by the Buddhist void. After that, we'll get into the Great Synthesis, and finally wrap up with the ultimate reality. Okay, part 1, the Axial Age revolution. To really understand this epic philosophical clash, we've got to set the stage with a totally revolutionary period in human thought.
So between 800 and 200 BCE, something incredible was happening. Thinkers across entirely different civilizations were simultaneously experiencing this profound transformation in consciousness. Up until this point, cultures mostly just believed the sacred and the worldly were, mashed together into one single reality. But right in the middle of this era, around 500 BCE, the Upaniṣads and Buddhism pop up, and they introduce a completely new way of looking at existence.
This brings us to a massive problem humanity was suddenly trying to solve. The philosopher Karl Jaspers called it the two-world ontology. Basically, people were waking up to the idea that the everyday world you and I experience, it's transient, it's conditioned, it's essentially an illusion. And they realized that a higher, transcendent truth, or ultimate liberation, has to exist entirely beyond it.
So how do we reach that higher truth? Let's look at the first major approach in part 2, the Upanishadic reality, which serves as our thesis.
The Upanishads offered a pretty powerful framework. They drew a hard line between samsara, which is the everyday suffering-filled world, and Brahman, the transcendent reality. They argued that human suffering is basically just a problem of avidya, or ignorance of our true nature. The fix? Liberation, or moksha. And that comes from realizing that your eternal soul, your Atman, is actually identical with Brahman. The physical world around us is just a dependent appearance.
The really crucial takeaway here is that beneath the illusion of everyday life, there's a positive, eternal, unchanging reality. Brahman is pure, non-dual consciousness. So ultimate reality isn't some dark, empty space. It's the fundamental ground of literally everything, and it's intimately connected to your very soul.
But shortly after, a rival heavyweight steps into the ring with a radically different solution. Welcome to part 3, the Buddhist void, our antithesis.
This is where the conflict gets really interesting. On one hand, you've got the Upanishads saying you have to realize your Atman, your eternal self. But on the other hand, Buddhism introduces anatman, the concept of non-self. They argued that craving and holding on to this idea of a permanent self is exactly what causes all of our suffering. So you can see how these two views are just fundamentally at odds with each other. Let's unpack that Buddhist perspective a bit more. Just like the Upanishads, Buddhism separates samsara from a higher state, which they call nirvana. Except liberation here comes from letting go of that attachment to the self. Later on, Mahayana philosophy took this even further with the concept of shunyaka, or emptiness. They taught that absolutely all phenomena are empty of any independent, inherent existence. There's no eternal soul hiding behind the curtain.
So when we put these side by side, the conflict comes right into focus. Both traditions are trying to escape the suffering of samsara, right? But look at the causes and the goals. The Upanishads blame ignorance and want you to realize a grand, eternal self. Buddhism blames attachment to that self and seeks emptiness. Their final destinations couldn't be more opposed. How in the world do you reconcile an eternal everything with an eternal nothing?
Well, that brings us to our climax, part 4, the Great Synthesis. Let's look at Advaita Vedānta.
Enter two brilliant thinkers, Gaudapada and his successor, Adi Shankara. Together, they forged Advaita Vedānta, and they did something absolutely ingenious to break this philosophical gridlock. They took the sharp, analytical, dialectical methods of Mahayana Buddhism, especially from thinkers like Nagarjuna, and used them to validate the authority of the Upanishads. Think about that. They basically used their rivals' tools to build their own philosophical house.
Here's a perfect example of how they pulled this off. Gaudapada has this doctrine of non-origination, and he states, from the highest standpoint, nothing is ever truly born or produced. Now, this sounds incredibly similar to the Buddhist critique of dependent origination. Gaudapada is actually agreeing with the Buddhist here. He's saying the everyday world of multiplicity has no independent, ultimate reality. It just appears that way because of our ignorance.
Then Shankara comes along and beautifully systematizes all of this. Step 1. Subject ordinary experience to intense, rigorous philosophical analysis. Step 2. Prove that the phenomenal world is conditioned and dependent, again, using those super sharp Buddhist methods to tear down our attachment to the empirical world. But then, step 3, instead of ending in emptiness, reveal that the underlying ground of everything is pure consciousness, which brings us right back to the Upanishadic conclusion. He deconstructed the illusion exactly like a Buddhist, but ultimately said no thanks to the Buddhist void.
To make this synthesis totally airtight, Shankara split reality into two distinct levels. First, you have empirical reality. That's the conditioned, dependent world of everyday experience we're all living in right now. Then you have absolute reality, the highest standpoint where ultimate truth is realized. By doing this, he could say, hey, the Buddhists are right about the empirical world, but the Upanishads are right about the absolute world.
Which leads us to the final resolution of this epic drama. Part 5, the ultimate reality.
This right here is the masterstroke of Advaita Vedānta, where Madhyamaka Buddhism refuses to posit an ultimate ground beyond emptiness, basically dissolving the illusion into a metaphysical void. Advaita Vedānta pivots. It dissolves the illusion into a direct realization of pure, self-luminous, non-dual consciousness. The everyday world isn't transcended into a void, it's transcended into Brahman.
So, the big takeaway from this explainer is that Advaita Vedānta preserves the Upanishadic idea of an ultimate, unchanging reality, but it seamlessly folds in the penetrating analytical methods of Mahayana Buddhism. For Gaudapada and Shankara, these two wildly different streams converge into a mature, non-dual philosophy. It is a perfectly balanced view and, honestly, one of the highest philosophical achievements of the Axial Age.
I want to leave you with a provocative question to ponder. If ultimate reality is purely non-dual consciousness, meaning there is absolutely zero separation between you and the universe, then who is experiencing the illusion? Think about that for a bit, because it cuts right to the core of what it means to even exist. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and keep questioning the reality around you.